It's always really good to see faces in real life and to bring alive the really brilliant ecosystem and network that we've managed to build at Outlier Ventures over the last decade, 11 years actually. Because what is Outlier Ventures? What is an accelerator other than an ecosystem? So it's all you guys that make up part of that, whether it's the founders, alumni, mentors, investors, protocol partners. Great to see so many of you here today. And it's even more exciting to be able to kind of share our updated vision and thesis, which is a continuation, an evolution of our Convergence thesis that we developed back in 2017, when we made our first, what would be now referred to as DAI investment, which was pre-seed, like first ticket into Fetch.ai, which of course went on to become to be Artificial Super Intelligence Alliance. And we did our first deep investment then as well. Before that was a term, which was IOTA. So we've been thinking about agents and the convergence of blockchain with AI for several years. And that thesis translated into near 400 investments now. So a huge amount of learnings that's come from that, from the hard work of founders. And it was really at the summer of last year, I took a little bit of time off as a step back to chairman away from CEO after 11 years of grind. And then was pulled back into the space because all of a sudden this convergence thesis started to happen. The process of convergence started to happen. Agents were mainstreaming. And so I kind of tapped into that brain trust of founders that we've got and just started to ask them what their learnings were. How they were thinking about business models, go-to-market strategies in an agentic internet. Anyway, fast forward after hundreds of conversations, that translated into the post-web and the post-web thesis, which is what I'm going to share with you here today. So in short, agents really do change the game, and I imagine that's not necessarily new news to many of you here in the room. But I think it's important to kind of reflect and pause on why it's such a game changer. And actually, what is the game that's being changed? What are the innovations? And ultimately, the paradigm shift is that startups today, web startups, web services, have primarily relied upon human inefficiency. We're really bad at handling complexity. We settle for suboptimal outcomes. We settle for convenience, habit, and shortcuts like brand loyalty. But of course, agents don't care about any of that. In fact, they get better and better at making decisions and bypassing moats and making decisions on our behalf and doing so logically. And so when you really start to think about this, you actually need a new playbook for founders to navigate this space, to understand the challenges, the opportunities of this new paradigm. And I guess if there's one message that I would like you to take away from today, is that really the mental shift is away from thinking about value capture, thinking about extraction, value extraction, and thinking much more towards incentive-driven participation. So agents really do offer a new paradigm shift because they add a new set of functionality to the internet. They allow us to add to read, write, and own, to now delegate. And so this means that we're going to delegate increasing amounts of the consumer internet to agents to do things on our behalf, which means that the internet is going to reorient towards intent-based architectures. And this is no small thing. It also means that our role in these processes, the human in the loop, when required, be it for regulatory reasons or just because we desire to be involved, our experience of the web UX and the interface will be hyper-contextual. So it will know what mode I'm in, it will minimize that experience, it will create something on the fly, just for me in order to most effectively make that decision. So all that's really cool, but actually what makes it even more exciting is the power of convergence, because when agents take on the characteristics of Web3, they leverage Web3 infrastructure, they can also become more deterministic, and you really want that when you're extending your personhood to agents. You're wanting them to carry out economic activity on your behalf. You're wanting them to negotiate and enter into legal agreements. Well, guess what? Web3 and smart contracts, of course, are really good for that. And the more that agents start interacting amongst themselves, agent to agent, you also want degrees of verifiability. So actually, who wouldn't want all the characteristics and principles of Web3 imbued in this new agentic internet? But what's also really cool is that agents make Web3 usable, because the assumption has been that Web3, its primary user are people. That's proven to not be true. Not many people are actively daily using Web3. And that's because it's really internet functionality. There's no real native Web3 interface to make it usable. And so as a consequence, the principles of digital property rights, a token for everything, token designs, DAOs, none of these things have mainstreamed. LLMs are going to give us a more intuitive natural language interface to interact with blockchains, and agents are going to carry out the execution of this stuff with increasing levels of complexity on-chain on our behalf. So not only does it introduce delegate, it actually unlocks own. So for us, after a lot of thought, this translates into what we've called the post-web stack. Don't worry about trying to make sense of that. You can download it online. And I've got a more simplified version for you here, which just kind of illustrates this kind of reorientation that happens in the post-web. Because what happens is everything begins with a user's intent. And so it begins with the user, and those intents are then solved for by this agent layer. And the agent layer orchestrates the entirety of that stack specific to the context to deliver the most optimal, efficient, effective outcome. But what's interesting is that kind of dotted line where you see basic needs and high needs, that used to be the web layer, the web interface that people would do stuff and interact over the internet. The large majority of basic needs, very transactional things we'd rather not be doing on the consumer internet, will be delegated entirely to agents with minimal human in the loop. So there is no web interface layer for the majority of things agents are going to do. They don't need it. They just need APIs, SDKs, access to other agents. What is left is what we're calling the thin web, which is the residual web, where there is a requirement for human in the loop. Again, that could be for regulatory reasons. It could be because of the value of a transaction. It could just be because there's a desire for a more immersive experience, let's say e-commerce or something like that. But the consequence of this is really significant. And this might seem quite flippant or throwaway to say, but when you start meditating on it, like I have for the last several months now, it becomes more and more profound. The internet today, its economy is organized around this kind of paperclip maximization of attention to the detriment of everything else. So we all have this weird relationship with the web at the moment. We find ourselves doom scrolling and like, what the fuck was I doing? Like, why am I here? We're constantly interrupted, distracted, making suboptimal outcomes. It's not healthy. But not only that, it doesn't work for those that subsidize free web services on the attention economy, advertisers, because they're getting like 2% conversion rate on adverts. So it's actually an entirely false economy. But that doesn't matter. This isn't an ethical argument about why we should get rid of the attention economy. It's just suboptimal, and agents care about optimal outcomes. They don't necessarily care about ethics. And so the flip is the internet begins to organize around intentions, and I believe creates an intention economy. So we move from the attention economy to the intention economy, where the internet organizes around solving for intentions. And this is a huge win for all of us as consumers on the internet. Because, as I said, the current status quo is we get suboptimal outcomes. Everybody, all stakeholders get suboptimal outcomes, advertisers, consumers. But also, the business model of the attention economy is maximally extractive. They build moats to extract as much value as possible and creates this weird relationship between the shareholders of platforms and the users, and there's a million examples of that. In the post-web, agents remove rent-seeking as much as possible. That's an inefficiency, so it's going to be removed. So you end up with minimally extractive paradigm, and you end up with more optimal outcomes. And the consequence of that is faster, cheaper, better, which is the holy grail for changing consumer behavior. So for a long time, we've been lecturing people on why they should use Web3 and been ignored, rightly. Now we've got something that's just faster, cheaper, better. So why wouldn't you use it? So if this is the death of the web interface layer, well, it's also the death of classic startup theory. So all the kind of assumptions about how you build, design, scale, grow, classic startups become largely obsolete. Not completely, but largely. This is because if the agent is primarily creating the UX on the fly, then UX and product moats don't exist, or at least are more limited, restricted. Because all of this stuff is built on Web3 infrastructure where you have composability, you have transferability, there are limited exit and switching costs, fewer lock-ins. This means more limited loyalty and retention. This fundamentally breaks most of the flywheels that startups are predicated on. It minimizes network effects, not all, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. It limits many economies of scale, and it limits the impact of growth capital and venture capital to give outsized competitive advantage. And potentially, this changes things and challenges this zero-sum winner-takes-all that Silicon Valley has been based upon for the last few decades. So that's kind of probably quite alarming to most founders who are still understandably thinking in terms of classic startups. So I've just given you a problem. The bad news is I don't have the answers, but I do have a set of questions. And it's those kind of questions that I'm going to explore with you here. We're trying to develop frameworks to help founders navigate. And to use kind of a Donald Rumsfeld-ism, there are lots of unknowns. What we address in the post-web and the documents we've created and the frameworks are the known unknowns. We have a set of questions, but there's lots of unknown unknowns, especially as you get into agent to agent. But what we do know about this new paradigm, this new reality is it's self-referential, it's self-optimizing systems. Much of the innovation is going to happen in open source form, which means things will be forked, they'll be replicated, they'll be tweaked, they'll be improved, probably by agents. This will see a great disappearing of many web startups, classic web startups. It will see an unbundling of the web. There's a great book by Tim Wu, I think, called Master Switch, which talks about these decades of bundling and unbundling that happen in information technologies. This potentially breaks that for the first time ever in information technology paradigm, because I'm not sure that when the web gets unbundled, how it gets rebundled back up. I don't know what a platform in an agentic internet looks like. Is it a swarm? Is it a hive? Is it, who knows what it is? So what we do know is this is going to be a constant state of hyperdisruption. There's going to be a marginalization of rent seeking, where you're taking too much margin. This will see a mass commoditization of many offerings, many web services. And in some ways, the system kind of self-cannibalizes itself. So again, like quite alarming stuff if you're a founder thinking, how do I create a sustainable proposition in this space? Because the reality is most disruptors will be disrupted. And so you're kind of having to get comfortable with a constant state of disruption. Now, this doesn't mean that there will be no moats, and it doesn't mean that there'll be no network effects. And again, I don't have the answers, sadly, and there might be some things that aren't necessarily generalizable. But for example, I think it'd be safe to say that there may be more moats the closer you get to the user, because people aren't changing. We're still going to have our biases, and our agents may represent those biases, delivering not always the most optimal outcome, but the best outcome for me based on my biases. We also know that using Maslow's hierarchy of needs, relationships are important as humans. We're probably going to fall in love with our personal assistant, if you've not already. The digital one, by the way. And equally, our social graph is going to be very sticky. But does that social graph translate into a platform? I don't know. I think a social graph could be this layer of augmentation as we navigate the world. So there are some things that won't change, where it's people involved and relationships and emotions. But the minute you start going to agent, things just get a little bit bonkers. And that we had a founder session with 10 founders from our portfolio prior to this event to start talking through the consequences of agent to agents. How are they going to collaborate? How are they going to compete? What might their biases be in terms of how they interact? And there's a lot of uncertainties. Actually, there's one more thing around network effects. So I personally think that, especially in the context of DLT, you've got to remember, agents don't have to use DLT. They have a decision, should I use DLT for a particular purpose or not? And in many cases, it'll just be too expensive. It'll be too prohibitive, it's too slow. And this is universally true. And that's because usually DLT are introducing trust mechanisms to allow for trustless environments, but that just adds cost. So the thing is, and it's very hard to bootstrap in a trustless environment when it's a new network and has low density, low transaction volume. But the more nodes you have in the network, the more density, the more times you're pinging those nodes, you're carrying out counterparty transactions, whatever that might be, the more probability you know the human or the agent is going to behave well. And you can remove some of those trust mechanisms and be more optimistic in nature. And I personally think agents will prefer optimistic environments, but that's really hard to do if you don't have the data points to know you don't need the trust mechanism for this particular transaction. So networks that can achieve more optimistic states of finding consensus, managing risk, I think will have moats, and that could be relevant for capital, it can be relevant for compute, it can be relevant for data. So hopefully you're beginning to get a sense of what I'm saying now, which is actually we're not really talking about startups now. We're talking about systems. And in systems, it's really about how you are going to design and coordinate these systems. It's not about startups, it's not about static products. And so for founders, I think it's going to be really important to shift mindset away from company building towards co-creating ecosystems and ultimately finding system fit. What is your fit with the system? How are you upgrading that system? How are you making it function better? And largely allowing agents to do things more efficiently, more effectively. And so as a founder contributing to these networks, it's around incentives, it's around system alignment, but ultimately it's about participation rather than just extraction. If your motive is purely to extract as much as possible, you will be removed from the network. You'll be optimized out of the network. You will be treated as malicious. So again, how can we begin to compare these two paradigms of the web today and building in it and the post-web? Well, largely we're going from UX, user experience, to agent experience. We're moving away from product design as a USP to incentive design. Growth strategies are replaced by finding system fit, designing incentive systems that incentivize certain types of behaviors in those systems. We're moving away from hierarchical, top-down, command and control organizations to something that's much more emergent, dynamic, most likely multi-agent systems. And how capital will be invested into these systems is probably not going to look like classic venture capital anymore. It's going to be more about putting in capital into bonding curves for people to solve problems once they've solved the problem. So kind of a reward system, bountying system. So ultimately what we're saying is, as a founder, you're trying to design, create, build anti-fragile systems. And really that requires an entirely different set of skills that not many startups have. And to be quite frank, I personally struggle with many of these domains. We've got lots of brilliant people at Outlier. Dimi at the back has headed up our token engineering team for a very long time now. There's only so much I can understand because my math literacy is pretty poor to understand its kind of complexity. But the kind of things you need to understand are game theory, intention theory. There's decades of intention theory about how agents might interact, form biases, organize, compete. Of course, incentive design, and looking at new methodologies around governance, and of course, DAOs. Well, all of this stuff in aggregate is what you would refer to as token engineering. So not just token design, but bringing engineering principles and rigor to make sure that these systems can handle economic loads in safe ways. Just you would like a bridge to be able to handle traffic over it and not collapse. You need surety it's going to be able to handle that as a system. And so again, token engineering is a relatively new discipline, and it brings together all these disciplines and applies it to token design. The difference is that the participant and the stakeholders, again, are primarily going to be agents. The good thing is agents are more logical than people. And if you just look at DAOs, when it's people trying to do DAOs, it doesn't work because people aren't rational and logical. They don't follow the game theory. But agents will, and they'll be really effective at it. So, as a founder of an existing startup, or you're thinking about what's the new startup you're going to do, or even you're sat in an enterprise, an incumbent, what are the kind of zero-day questions that you've got to ask yourself? Because the reality is, it is zero-day for all of us, including Outlier Ventures, by the way. We're a knowledge economy company. That's going to get heavily disrupted by agentic networks. So we ourselves are having to think about what we agentify, what's going to be commoditized, what will continue to be valuable. But the kind of questions with this kind of systems mindset is, are you creating a new system entirely, or are you optimizing the existing system? Are you a coordinator or are you a contributor? If you're a coordinator, again, coming back to token engineering principles, there should be something you're optimizing for, an optimizing function, and that should be able to be expressed mathematically, simply, in order that you can measure its effectiveness. So every network, in theory, should have an optimizing function, and it should be able to be expressed mathematically. If you are a contributor, what are you contributing to the system? Is it data? Is it code? Is it SDKs? Is it knowledge? Actually, delegation isn't one way. Agents will delegate to people sometimes as well. Your future boss might be an agent. And then as a contributor, are you contributing to a generalizable problem across systems? Or are you trying to solve a set of problems in a vertical way through some kind of synergies between your code, your agents, or something else? It's actually my belief that the majority of founders will participate in multiple systems. Because why wouldn't you? Like, being a founder with one startup is really risky. Most fail. And catastrophically fail. You know, you use a lot of money, there's a lot of time. And so I imagine that founders are going to start to be a little bit more VC-like. You're going to want to spread your bets, you're going to allocate your time, knowledge, expertise across different problem sets. And so I think the future in the post-web is going to look a lot more like a proto founder gig economy, where you take stakes in systems relative to the risk you take, the value that you contribute. So in summary, and this is very much a draft version, it probably change tomorrow. You might even have input that I would love to hear. But to just give you a starting base, here are 10 principles that you can build for or invest in the post-web. The first one should be fairly obvious to anybody in Web3, but it is worth stating because we want to bring in people from outside of Web3, from traditional AI, to build for hypermodularity over monolithic platforms. You don't need to solve all the problems yourself. You can bundle things together and just execute on a particular new innovation. You will be designing primarily for agents. Might not be today, but your future roadmap should be thinking about agents being the user, what they need, what they don't need. But you're doing it with people in mind because people won't disappear. There'll always be a human in the loop at some point, and there's usually a business model in that. You're optimizing for solving systemic intention. The system will be solving for different kinds of intents, and you're looking to solve for something at a system level, efficiently with marginal rent seeking. Focus on system fit through alignment and how you can upgrade and improve that system. Of course, more from a design perspective, leveraging game theory to incentivize positive emergent behaviors, but also penalize negative ones. So this kind of behavior economics is what will drive a lot of these systems. It's moving away from relying on static moats, static business models, and preparing for continuous disruption, which is going to be fucking stressful, as if being a founder wasn't already stressful enough. It's focusing on prioritizing for contributing and participating rather than value extraction. I've already said, thinking of yourself as a system, not a company. So how might I incentivize other groups of people to collaborate on solving a class of problems with me, what you might call a startup? How do I incentivize, how do I reward them? And most importantly, token design itself needs to be dynamic and evolutionary. Your token design can't be static because it will be gamed, it will be attacked, and it will also have to evolve for this continuous fit with the system it's trying to play into. And of course, in all of that, data is important, data integrity, because rubbish in, rubbish out in terms of the decisions that are going to be made by agents. So, in conclusion, I believe the post-web isn't about creating the next super app. It isn't about creating a unicorn startup. You might achieve unicorn-like returns in aggregate in your time for participating in these systems. But it's really about that kind of system fit. And then finally, a closing thought, because this has just really upset me about the last 12 months. And I think everybody at Outlier, because we work with founders all day, every day, busting their gut to build utility. And they spent the last year being told by idiots who just stream all day long, who've never had a job and never built anything of value, that utility is pointless. And this kind of financial nihilism that we've all had to subscribe to, like, hopefully that's coming to an end, because we got to remember all this stuff was a protest against that in the first place. So I'm a utility maxi. I'm here to back people who are building for utility. And the great thing about an agentic internet is agents like utility. They'll follow logic in a way that people never would. And perhaps that was always the failing for Web3. So that's it. As I said, this is a set of questions. I don't really have answers. We will be releasing a framework in the next 4 weeks. We're playfully calling it Zero to Many. We'll see if we get sued, I don't know, or shot, one of the two. But again, I invite you to help us figure this stuff out. Much of these learnings are not mine. They're not my insights. I'm an idiot. It comes from this brilliant brain trust of founders that we've got. So I welcome you all on this journey.